Welcome to today's webcast, Rise of the Robot, Is Your Organisation Ready? I'm Neil Plumridge, PwC Australia's Managing Partner for Consulting. And joining me today are two great speakers. We've got Martin Ford, author from Rise of the Robots, and looking forward to hearing Martin talk today, and PwC's Global People and Organisation Leader, John Williams. Before we start today, I'd like to invite you to submit questions, and you can do that with the form that's on your screen, or you can hashtag AU in transition. So without further ado, let's get started. Welcome, Martin, and welcome, John.
Yeah.
John, as you know, I'm really passionate about Australia's place in the world. We've got an abundance of resources above the ground in people. We've also got a lot of resources under the ground in minerals, but I'm really excited to understand how we can deploy those resources, human capital resources we have. But recently, a number of our colleagues wrote a report saying that 44% of jobs over the next 20 years in Australia, that's 5 million jobs, may disappear or be disrupted significantly through automation and robotics. I'm interested in your thoughts on, is that something similar to what we're seeing perhaps 20, 30 years ago in the 1970s and 1980s, or is it a different phenomenon?
Thanks, Neil. So it would be glib to say that this is the white-collar version of the blue-collar event that happened in the 70s. That's an easy statement, is to say we're simply seeing in offices what we saw in factories. I actually think, and Martin may characterise this differently, I think of four waves that have happened or are going to happen. So the first wave was very clearly in the 70s and 80s. So in factories, in controlled and regulated environments that we had built or created, where there were standard tasks being carried out by humans, many of those were replaced by robots at increasing degrees of precision. So we went from gross motor tasks to fairly precise tasks over time in those environments. And that was the first wave. That's kind of what you're referring to. The second wave was the shift into unregulated or uncontrolled environments. So self-driving trucks in mine sites, self-driven, robot-driven gantries on the docks. So in different environments, outdoors or not completely controlled. And that wave is still happening, and self-driving cars is probably the end of that wave. The third wave, which is what I think we're mostly talking about, is then taking that concept into offices. So how do we start to do routine, standard, office-based, white-collar tasks through robots, computerization, and machine learning? And in particular, that relates to the professions, so accountants, people in the firm that we work in, yes. Tax professionals, lawyers, increasingly doctors from a diagnostic perspective. So how do you take those routine, often binary decision-making situations and convert those into a task done by a robot or a computer? So that's the wave that I think is about to begin, and that software is already in place. And we know that robots or computers make better diagnostic decisions than doctors in many instances, and make less errors in decision-making. And then the fourth wave will be going into non-routine white-collar work. So decision-making, responding to unusual situations, responding to new situations. And that's the wave that we probably haven't quite got to yet, and that's the one that will come in 10 or 20 years. And exactly what that looks like, we probably don't know yet. Maybe Martin does. I'm not sure that we quite know what that's going to look like yet.
So do you see the change happening at the same time across all industries? And here in Australia, we've got financial services, yep. Healthcare, a lot of government sectors.
So I think that's fascinating because this isn't the first time, and the reason I'm relatively optimistic about what's going to happen, this isn't the first time this sort of thing has happened. So the agrarian revolution, a similar thing happened, right? So you go back hundreds of years, and 95% of people worked on the land, and they couldn't possibly envisage what you could do if you weren't working on the land. And now it's less than 1%, and there are whole jobs that they couldn't envision at that time. The Industrial Revolution did the same thing. But if you think about each of those, they didn't happen all of a sudden once in every place on Earth and in every industry. They happened at bits and pieces at different times, in different locations around the world at different paces. So it's not a switch that's going to be turned and everything's going to be different. In different industries and different geographies, it'll happen at a different pace, and it'll reflect the nature of the roles that are performed. So the extent to which we can use computers or robots to replace them or augment them, but also it'll invest capital. It'll reflect capital investment. It'll reflect a risk aversion. It'll reflect a willingness to change. There are a whole bunch of human decisions that need to be taken that will either trigger this or or not trigger this happening at a certain speed. And you know what? We have choice. Right? We do actually have choice in this in this space. I was overseas recently and read that, so Singapore just introduced their first fully automated food court. It's at Changi Airport. So they've introduced a fully automated food court. Right? So you go to a machine, you tap in what you want to buy, you put your credit card up against it, a machine makes the food, you go to a little hatch, it pops out, you get it, and you eat it. They've got 4% of their population works in food production, and it's only 1% of GDP, so they're trying to balance that up a little bit. At Changi Airport, I'd probably be happy to engage in that, because I'm traveling, I'm tired, I don't want to have to engage someone who might not speak the same language as me, that I might make bad choices and there's a whole bunch of stuff that would say that would be a good situation. If you go to Satay Street in Singapore, I absolutely want a human being to be there to serve me, to look me in the eye. Absolutely. So that's a choice that we could have had fully automated pubs 10 years ago. You can make a dispensing machine that dispenses beer. We don't want that. We're actually choosing to have a person to interact with. So there are human choices in this. It's not just an automatic process that will happen. And it will happen at different paces in different places.
Fascinating. Martin, when you released your book, best-selling New York Times book, there was quite a lot of criticism around, this is science fiction and the like. As you've talked around the world, there's increasing conversations are going, well, this is not science fiction, this is real now. Are you seeing that in the different places you go, that people are now thinking of this not as something that may happen, but something that definitely will, or how are you finding that?
I think that people are taking it a lot more seriously. It's an idea that's gaining traction. I mean, it must be said that there's still not a consensus by any means. I mean, you could, I think, easily find economists in particular, probably economists that have Nobel Prizes, in other words, brilliant people who would tell you that this is all silly, this is not something we should worry about, because of course it's happened so many times in the past. It goes back at a minimum 200 years to the Luddite revolts, and since then this fear has come up again and again. So there are some people who seem to have this belief that there's some kind of an economic law that says that people are always going to remain relevant and will have jobs. I don't really see things that way. And what I find is that especially among technical people, the people that are really working on these technologies, people working in AI, there's a kind of an emerging realization that this is going to be a disruption. And what it really comes down to is that the machines are taking on cognitive capability. They're beginning in a limited way to think, and that's something that really is quite different than anything that's happened before. And the other thing is that this is really now a general purpose technology. It's something that's just going to scale across everything. So that's, again, quite different from what we saw in agriculture, for example, where you had tractors and combines that were enormously disruptive, but they were also very specific to that one sector of the economy, right? They didn't invade the other areas. But information technology and AI is going to be almost like a utility, like electricity, right? And you wouldn't ask what areas of the economy, what industries are going to be impacted by electricity. I mean, the answer is all of them, everywhere, right? And the same is going to be true of artificial intelligence. So I do think we're looking at a bigger disruption this time.
Are you seeing any particular country or any types of companies ahead of the curve, really adopting this as first movers and others that are more laggards, or is it sort of everyone around the world is adopting it at the same pace?
Well, certainly Silicon Valley is leading the actual technology, and of course there's companies like Google and Amazon and Microsoft that are especially involved in research into deep learning, which is the driving force behind this. But it's going to, I think, disseminate very, very rapidly. I mean, I think that there are very few barriers for this technology to invade just about every industry. So I expect it to really sort of come online across the board. The more interesting question, I think, that you point to is, are there countries or political systems that are really beginning to think about the implications of this and wonder what should we do about it? And I've gone around the world and talked to some governments, mostly in Europe. For example, in the Netherlands, they seem to be very keen on thinking about this. Singapore has been mentioned a number of times, of course. I'm going to Austria actually later this week to talk to some people in their ministry. So there are many governments, I think including Australia, that are thinking about this at least. I even went to an event in the White House under President Obama and had a discussion about this. I'm not sure what's going to happen in the United States now in the next 4 years, but.
And so what role do you think governments have? I mean, I think there's always this debate about the government has a role to pick winners or not. There's always a debate about big government versus small government. We have that debate here, and no doubt it's in other countries around the world. In this particular spot, with the technology moving so fast, do you see governments as observers of the technology or participants in funding the evolution or startups? I mean, what role do you see governments
Well,
playing?
certainly, government has got a big role in funding research in terms of driving the technology, because it's reliant on a lot of basic research. But the role of government that particularly concerns me going forward is that I believe that this has the potential to greatly make inequality much worse, and I think that a lot of people are likely to be left behind. And of course, it's going to be those people that are best equipped to do things that are fundamentally routine and predictable. I mean, and that's probably a pretty good share of the population. The people that have always had that kind of a job and are probably best equipped to do that kind of job. And that those people are going to find it harder and harder. I think that ultimately it's going to have to be the role of government to step in and make sure that inequality doesn't get too extreme, to make sure that people have access to some sort of a fundamental safety net, that they don't fall too far. I mean, in an advanced country like Australia or the United States, we obviously hope that a huge fraction of the population is not going to, fall below a certain level and begin to really lose hope and faith in the system. And of course, the unfortunate reality is we're seeing some evidence of that around the world already. So that's what I am mostly concerned about, and I do think that there's absolutely an important role for government and for policymakers in that arena.
So can I just add to that? So I think government does need to think about how we pick up that portion of the population that gets left behind. And I think Martin and I are in agreement that there's going to be a period of dislocation of many people as this happens and as jobs disappear. Because when jobs go, they tend to go in swathes, and they were placed in smaller increments. That's just the way the world works. You don't suddenly invent 1,000 new jobs, but you can make 1,000 people redundant very quickly. I think we disagree on whether or not in the long run that'll work out or not. I take a more optimistic view. But even in the short term, governments have got to grapple with this whole notion of a living wage. So do we provide a living wage to everyone just to provide for them? And if we do, how do we construct a tax system that pays for that? I think the current tax system taxes both corporates, but also taxes individuals who create value for the organisation. As they go, do we start taxing the robots instead of the people, or do we change the corporate tax system to pick up enough money to pay for those that have been left behind? Government also needs to think about how it responds to unions. So obviously the union movement, which is still in some countries relatively strong, relatively powerful, has a huge role to play in this, because you can't be a union for robots. You can be a union for people. I was in the US a couple of weeks ago. The Teamsters Union is the biggest union or the biggest employer of people in 37 of the states. So people that drive trucks. Well, think of one of the most easily replaced jobs in the next 5 or 10 years will be truck drivers. So how the union responds to that and how the government interacts with the union to find a way to make that transition work, I think will be fascinating. And then the third piece I'd add would be, there's been this huge wave of outsourcing of both, also offshoring of both manufacturing and service delivery. Manufacturing may well become local again, rather than long distance, because we'll be able to, 3D print stuff in. The fascinating story of, you think of a plumber. A plumber these days goes to your house and finds the part needs to be replaced under the sink, and goes to Bunnings and buys the part and comes back and fits it and doesn't quite. Well, they'll go to their van and they'll print the part in their van, and then they'll go and fit the part. So you get rid of logistics and you get rid of manufacturing overseas. And then many of the jobs that have been offshored are jobs that are easily replaced, because they're relatively routine and mundane, easily replaced in a virtual way by robots. So there's a government interplay in that, as well as how different countries work together to make that whole system work. So I think I agree. Governments has a huge role to play in moderating the way that this change occurs.
Interesting stuff. Look, we could keep going. I think though I'd be keen to hear from the audience, and if you've got some questions, please submit them through the form or through the hashtag AUI in transition. The first question that we do have has come through, Martin, I might throw to you on this one first, is what should people in the workforce do now, or even parents with children that are about to enter the workforce, do to prepare for the next 10 years with a high degree of automation and robots?
Right. I think, what we've been saying, what we definitely agree on is that work that is routine, predictable, is going to be very susceptible. So if you're going to school, the last thing you want to be doing is studying so you can do a routine job. And that, at the extreme, that might include something like a radiologist, a doctor that interprets medical images, in which, it takes an incredible amount of training to get to that point. And yet I think that's a job that someday will be done exclusively by computers. So it's not necessarily about how much education you get, it's about the nature of what you're training for. And I think for the foreseeable future, your best bet is to really focus on doing something creative, something where you're really generating something new as opposed to manipulating information in some routine way, or something that really involves deep interaction with other people. So you're building relationships with people, whether it's maybe something like nursing or being a doctor that works with patients, or whether it's in a business environment where you're building that kind of a deep relationship with clients. Those are the areas that I think are going to be less susceptible, at least over the short term, the next 10 or 20 years. Beyond that, nothing is off the table.
Exactly, John. Your thoughts?
So I largely agree. My youngest son, just finished his higher school exams last Friday. So he's been asking me this question most days for the last 6 months, and he's going into an industrial product design course at university. So that's okay. It's a design. It's a bit creative. There's a bit of human requirement in there. I think the shift is going to be away from this notion of going to school and then going to university and then doing the same thing for 40 years and then having a rest and then dying. Right? Which is still our current model for most people. Because you can't possibly spend 3 or 4 years learning things that are going to be technically relevant for your entire career in the way that many of us did. You could learn to be an accountant and apply that for 30 years. That's just not going to work. So we need to shift to a model where you learn a bit of stuff, you apply it, you know that might not last very long, and in 5 years' time you learn something else. So more the model of lifelong learning, I think, is where we need to shift to, rather than expecting to learn to be a lawyer or an accountant or a tax professional up front and then applying that forever. I think we need to focus more on those skills. So empathy, intuition, innovation, creativity. How do we foster those? There are many stories about young children have all those skills and we kind of beat it out of them through an education system that's still based on too much rote learning. So how do we develop those skills? And I feel very strongly that we need to be focusing on giving younger people in our society much greater resilience in themselves to be able to cope with what's coming. Because
so some of these skills are people coachable immediately? If you're in the workforce today, 75% of Australia is made up of service-based jobs and service-based industries. So, there's 5 or 6 million people that are, reading Martin's book and others' books, going, well, what do I do now?
Yep.
And so, what would be your advice to those in those jobs that are in danger of either being automated or disrupted? I mean, what can they do now?
So there's a great saying that someone's coined that I can't remember who it is, so I can't credit them now, which is don't rage against the machine, race with it. And I think that's advice everyone's got to take. Accept this is going to happen, and accept that the change is going to come, and figure out how you can apply yourself to get the most out of that situation. We often say the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet didn't kill accountants. Right? It might have killed bookkeepers, but it allowed accountants to actually do something much better and much more interesting and actually give advice and counsel rather than spend their time recording data. So how can you use that analogy in your job? How can you say, I'm going to be augmented by the fact that a robot or a computer can do this data manipulation much better than I can, but I will use that data in a unique way that only a human can to explain it to someone else and to allow them to make decisions based on it. So it's that acceptance of the change, awareness is going to happen, and then using your own skills to make the most of the situation.
Okay, so we've got another question. The question is, many people also currently gain their self-worth, self-actualisation, personal satisfaction from their paid employment. And let's face it, others measure them based on their job as well. To both of you, what do you think each of us and society as a whole needs to do to adjust emotionally and culturally to a post-work world? Who would like to go first? Martin?
I'll go first with that. You know, it's a challenge. Right now, in the world that we live in, jobs are kind of a package deal, and they come with an income, which is, of course, very important. And they also come with this combination of something to do to occupy your time and your sense of accomplishment and self-worth and so forth. And many people do derive a great deal from that. Not everyone. Some people have jobs that they despise. We should remember that too. But clearly, as human beings, we need both of those things. You know, in the future, we're going to need an income, and we're also going to need this sense that we're contributing something and doing something that has purpose. What I think, though, is that those don't necessarily have to come from the same place. I mean, we can look at a future where perhaps those things decouple, and they are both there, but they're provided by different sources. So it might be a guaranteed income or a universal basic income providing maybe the lion's share of our income, but then we find other things to do. And of course, there are a number of things that people do to fulfill them. You can work in the community as a volunteer. You can edit Wikipedia. People spend hours and hours doing that, and it's something that they obviously, take a sense of accomplishment from. So I think there are many examples there where we can solve that problem.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question. If you look at what we've just seen in the US election, an awful lot of the folk there are disaffected voters from a wave of dislocation that happened 20 years ago. There are stories of factory towns where the factory closed down 20 years ago and really hasn't been replaced, and we really haven't, as a society, found something better for those people to do. But I'm optimistic that in the long term there won't be, and this is where we disagree, that there won't be a post-work world, and that people will find things to do or will choose for them to do things. I'm always, this is a strange analogy, but I'm always fascinated by the TV show MasterChef, which is a TV show in Australia. 10 years ago, food was a pork chop on a plate with a couple of potatoes and something. Now we're spending time carving carrots into beautiful shapes. We're curating experiences for our fellow humans that you wouldn't have called a job, and you wouldn't have even thought of spending the time doing because you didn't have the time to do it 10, 20 years ago. But we will free up the time for those sort of artistic endeavours where we're trying to create a perfect world or a more perfect world or a more perfect experience for each other in a thing that might be called work and might not be called work. If you think of the agricultural revolution, they would look at people doing jobs now and say, that's not work. This is work. Work is getting your hands dirty. Well, we've evolved our view of what is work. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. People might do things that we wouldn't consider work now, but that give meaning and purpose to your life.
That's right.
And maybe that's work.
But the question is, are you going to be paid enough to do that? Is there going to be a market for that? And there may not be, and that's, I think, an argument for having perhaps some kind of a universal basic income in combination with these opportunities to do things that maybe will add incrementally to that income so you can earn more and also occupy your time. So I think that there's going to be a combination of solutions in the future.
People want to do stuff. Yeah. People actually want, and we all know that we're way more productive in real terms than we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but we haven't stopped working as hard. We're making the choice. We're choosing to spend time at work, and that's what people actually want to do. So there's a huge drive towards people wanting to find things to do, whether they're things that we currently call jobs or not. It is an open question. How we're going to afford that is an open question. I mean, the Swiss voted on a living wage earlier in the year. It was voted down, but it got 30% of the vote in favour. So this is a very real concept that might happen.
Great. So I encourage you to ask any question. There's the form on your screen, or you can hashtag AU in transition. Another question, a little bit more a simple question than the last one is, there's a debate on whether there will be partial jobs automated or full jobs, swags of jobs. What's your view? Is it partial jobs will disappear, activities, or are these whole occupations, whole jobs?
So, do you want me to start and then?
You.
So I think what we actually, so it's mostly partial jobs, because you look at few jobs are completely made up of tasks that can be automated, or at least automated at the same time. It might happen over sequence. We have a choice, though, of do we then simply say, well, let's take one person and have them do the 5 bits that were left over of the 5 jobs that have been partially replaced, or do we say, let's keep the 5 people and we'll allow them to do something else in an augmented way because some of their tasks have been done by a computer. So one is an efficiency play, and one is an increased delivery or customer service or service play. And you can respond to the same situation in either way. But I think it's much less whole jobs going in this wave than it is parts of jobs going and then us having to find a way to restructure tasks.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, for the most part, I think the impact is more holistic on organizations. It's not a one-to-one correspondence with a robot and a job. It's technology completely redefines the boundaries between jobs and shifts the work in entirely new ways. But again, that certainly will, I think, in many cases, result in consolidation. If you automate half of what 2 people are doing, then in many cases that's going to still result in the loss of one job. And of course, there are exceptions to that. If you think of self-driving cars, that is a pretty good direct substitute for a taxi driver, right? So, but for the most part, it's not a one-to-one correspondence between what we might call a robot and a worker.
Right. Look, it's been fascinating to talk to both of you. Martin Ford, New York Times bestseller of Rise of the Robots. John Williams, Global People and Organisation Leader. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for joining us on this webcast today. That's it. For more information, go to pwc.com.au. For now, goodbye.